Is it true that Philippines are slowly getting poorer? Have you ever wondered how Philippines' economic status modifies from time to time?
How Philippine peso currencies change its value?
How the process of the trading works?
And the people behind this growth? Are you ready to know the answers? Let's bring back the past and examine our history. Economic history of the Philippines. The Philippines used to be a development model, second only to Japan in terms of East Asian economy. When South Korea was a peasant country in the 1960s, the Philippines was one of the Asia's economic powerhouses. It made consumer items, processed raw materials, and built automobiles, televisions, and home appliances at its factories. Imported scrap manufacturers produced cements, textiles, and fertilizers.
For economic development in the Philippines in the 1950s and 60s, in 1962, the government devalued the peso and abolished import controls and exchange licensing. The peso fell by half to 3.90 pesos to the dollar. Traditional exports of agricultural and mineral products increased. However, the growth rate of manufacturing declined even further. Substantial tariffs had been put in place in the late 1950s, but they apparently provided insufficient protection. The limited impact of manufacturing also affected employment. The sector's share of the employed labor force, which had risen rapidly during the 1950s to over 12%, plateaued.
Impact of martial law on the Philippine economy in the 1970s and 80s. Marcos imposed martial law in September 1972, alleging that the country was facing both left and right-wing uprising. He formed a group of businessmen around him, gave them monopoly positions in the economy through presidential decrees and letters of instruction, and began funneling resources to himself and his allies, implementing what became known as crony capitalism.
And for the impact of the U.S. military bases on the Philippines economy. The economy of the Philippines in the Marcos years in many ways was propped by the Subic and Clark American military bases, trade with the United States, and income from overseas workers. The World Bank played a major role in planning and running the Filipino economy under martial law. There were three economic considerations from the point of view of the Philippine government. First, the proportion of the Philippine budget allocated for its armed forces was the smallest in the region, a fact linked to the presence of United States air and naval forces in the Philippines as well as direct military assistance. Second, in the latter half of 1980s, the bases directly employed between 40,000 and 68,000 Filipinos and contracted for goods and services from Filipino businesses. During this period, yearly base purchases of goods and services in the Philippine economy, when corrected for the estimated import content of the goods purchased, was in the range of 6.0 billion to 8.3 billion. And third, and politically very important consideration, was the sum given to the Philippines by the United States in connection with the presence of the bases, referred to as aid by United States officials and as rent by the Filipinos. In October 1988, the Philippine Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Raul Manglapus, and United States Secretary of the State, George Shultz, signed a 2-year agreement of US dollar 962 million and amount double the previous compensation but substantially less than the US dollar of 2.4 billion that the Philippines initially demanded. In 1991, talks over the future of the bases and the size of the terms of the aid or rent that would be given and consideration for continued United States access to military facilities and the Philippines was the most important unresolved issue. The decision of the Philippine administration to bring Secretary of Finance Jesus Estanislao into the negotiations in March 1991 was a further indication of the economic importance of the bases to the Philippine government.
Economic development in the Philippines in the early 20th century. A land-knowing aristocracy arose in the Philippines in the mid-19th century, based on the export of abaca or Manila hemp, sugar, and other agricultural products. Philippines' reliance on the United States was much more apparent at the time of independence. In 1946, especially in the aftermath of a disastrous wartime occupation by Japan. For a time, aid from the United States helped to offset negative trade deficit, but in 1949, the economy had collapsed. Import and foreign exchange was controlled or imposed by the Philippines government, which lasted until the early 1960s.
Economy under Ramos President Fidel Ramos in 1992 to 1998 was given high marks for handling the economy by breaking apart monopolies, liberalizing foreign investment laws, and privatizing business and industries by controlled powerful families. Ramos was credited with transforming the Philippines from a country with a history of poverty, corruption, rebellion, foreign eliteness, and tax evasion into an economic powerhouse that was not yet an Asian tiger but was sometimes referred to as an Asian tiger cow. The Philippine economy showed some improvement in early 1992, spurred by increases in agricultural production and in consumer and government spending. Budget deficits were well within IMF guidelines, 3.2 billion pesos in the first 2 months. At the end of April, the Treasury posted a 5.5 peso billion surplus as a result of higher than program revenue receipts, mainly from the sale of Philippine Airlines. One of the greatest threats to the Philippine economy in 1992 was the power shortage. The fall in the water level in Lake Lanao caused a 50% reduction in the power supply to Mindanao in December 1991, and the resumption of full power was not expected until almost the end of 1992. The power shortage in Luzon continued to be chronic. Power cuts of 4 to 5 hours per day have been common. To help to meet this chronic shortage, the government reactivated the contract with Westinghouse Corporation to restart construction on a 621 megawatts nuclear power plant on the Bataan Peninsula that had been abandoned in 1986. This plant, however, was not scheduled to go online until 1995. To get the Philippines economy going, Ramos and the Philippine Congress abolished tariffs and preferential terms that enriched the rich families. He reformed the banking system and drove down interest rates. He overhauled the electricity infrastructure so that the energy shortages and brownouts became a thing of the past. The growth rate during the Ramos years was a robust 5% a year, and inflation was in the single digits, down from 25% in 1990. Under his leadership, fiber optic lines were installed, property values soared, 5-star hotels and condominiums were built. The stock market showed big gains. Overseas workers began returning home, and the former American military bases at Subic and Clark became thriving trade and industrial centers. Foreign investment increased. Companies like Acer, a Taiwanese company, and Intel moved into the Philippines. Much of the prosperity was linked to investment from Hong Kong by tycoons like Gordon Wu, who shipped their money to Manila before the reunification with China. In the early 1990s, the Philippines was regarded as an economic rival of Thailand and Malaysia. Now it lags from behind them.
And for the economy under Estrada, there was a sense of optimism when Joseph Estrada was elected. Investors ushered this sense of hope and initially poured money into the Philippines. But it didn't take long for this optimism to evaporate. Foreign investors were turned off by cronyism, scandals, and favoritism towards Philippines companies. Estrada moved to tighten securities regulations, liberalized the trade of grains, and privatized the electricity industry. His effort to change laws limiting foreign ownership of the business to 40% was helped by his impeachment trial. He revived the culture of the corruption and was plagued by charges of cronyism. This was on top of inconsistent monetary policy, slow economic growth, and uncertainty brought about by terrorists and insurgencies. As Estrada became embroiled in scandal, the peso, the stock markets, and confidence in the Philippines as a place to invest dropped, and as his approval ratings dropped. Foreign companies like Philips Electronics and Johnson pulled out of the Philippines. After his ouster in 2001, he left behind a huge budget deficit and debt payments that were double what the country spent on health, education, and agriculture combined.
Economy under Arroyo. When Gloria Macapagal Arroyo was elected president in 2001, she was greeted with considerable excitement. Arroyo announced free market and anti-corruption initiatives that were both embraced by both locals and international business groups the day she was sworn in, and businessmen complimented her skills and abilities. There was a renewed sense of optimism.
And for the Philippine economy picks up in the 2010s under Benigno Aquino III. The Philippines economy picks up in the 2000s under Benigno Aquino III. The Philippine economy expanded by 7.2% in 2013, 6.8% in 2012, 3.7% in 2011, and 7.6% in 2010. In 2012, gross domestic product surpassed the government's forecast for growth of 5% to 6%. The Philippines had the second highest growth rate in the world 2012 after China, according to Reuters. Government expenditure in the Philippines jumped nearly 12% in 2012, while private spending, which was bolstered by remittances from abroad, was up 6.1%, Reuters reported. The Philippines has certainly had a steady flow of positive economic news recently. On July 4, 2012, Standard & Poor's raised the country's debt rating to just below investment grade, the highest rating for the country since 2003 and equivalent to that of Indonesia. The Philippines is the 44th largest economy in the world today, according to HSBC estimates. But if current trends hold, it can leap to the number 16 spot by 2050. The Philippine stock market, one of the best performers in the region, closed at a record high after recent S&P rating upgrade, and the country's currency, the peso, reached a 4-year high against the dollar at about the same time. But there are also real weaknesses in the country. Recent flooding, which by some estimates submerged 50% of Manila, illustrates our shortage of modern infrastructure that makes the Philippines highly vulnerable to disasters. The Philippines is hit with several deadly and devastating natural disasters every year. Another hurdle is in the fact that the Philippines has traditionally underexploited its natural resources. The government estimates that there are 21.5 billion tons of metal deposits in the country, including large deposits of nickel, iron, copper, and gold. But they have never been a significant driver for the economic growth because extraction has been mismanaged. The Philippines, with a 7.8% expansion of gross domestic product in the first quarter of 2013, has the fastest growing economy in the East Asia. Surpassing even China's, the country has a red hot stock market, a strong currency, and a steady stream of accolades and upgrades from international ratings agencies. Higher rates of economic growth over recent years have not made a serious dent in the employment problem in the Philippines.
Philippine economic rose 7.2% in 2013, beating government expectations. The Philippine economy expanded by 7.2% in 2013, combined with 2012 Philippines experiences its strongest 2 years of growth since the 1950s. A recovery in advanced economies may help President Benigno Aquino achieve his goal of bolstering growth to as much as 8.5% by 2016 as he transforms the country into a manufacturing hub. Rising exports have helped counter the impact of Super Typhoon Haiyan, and the central bank said today it will act if needed to contain inflation expectations. The Philippine economy clearly still has strong momentum despite the typhoon. The Philippines won its first investment grade scores from Moody's Investors Service, Fitch Ratings, and Standard & Poor's last year. Aquino's pledge to curb corruption and spur faster growth has seen foreign direct investment almost double to $2.8 billion in 2012 from 2008. World Bank data show the Philippines remain as one of the best performing economies in the Asian region in the fourth quarter of 2013. Second only to China, which grew by 7.7%, Balisacan said. Meanwhile, on the demand side, growth was boosted by household consumption, which contributed 4.2 percentage points, and net exports, which contributed 1.6 percentage points, despite the better-than-expected growth. However, some sectors tamed overall growth for 2013, Balisacan said. Construction had the biggest setback in the fourth quarter. The subsector contracted by 0.8% due to stricter rules imposed on real estate lending compliance with prudential regulations. The Board of Investment has also tightened mass housing incentives, the rule requiring developers to allot 20% of their total housing investment for low-cost mass housing units is now being closely monitored and enforced.
And for the Philippine economy in 2014, disasters slowed the Philippine economic growth down to 5.7% in first quarter of 2014. Philippine economic growth slowed a year-on-year to 5.7% in the first quarter of 2014 as natural disaster weighed on production. This makes the Philippines the third fastest growing economy in the Asia after China, which is 7.4%, and Malaysia 6.2%. National Economic and Development Authority Secretary Arsenio Balisacan said. The growth lowest since the fourth quarter of 2011 was also below market and government expectations. Meanwhile, the January to March expansion was driven by the services and industry sectors, which climbed 6.8% and 5.5% respectively, the Philippine Statistic Authority said. Balisacan said natural disasters that hit the country late last year, particularly Typhoon Haiyan, pulled economic growth down. The effects of the typhoon went beyond the Yolanda affected areas through the supply chain. Balisacan said, using the local name for Haiyan, that affected investment plans for the companies and individuals. Private construction suffered in the first quarter. In November 2013, Haiyan killed around 6,300 people in the Philippines and destroyed $2 billion worth of crops and infrastructure. In October, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck the province of Bohol, also in central Philippines, causing widespread devastations. In October, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck the province of Bohol, also in central Philippines, causing widespread devastations.
That's it! Did we answer all your confusions about our economic history? Let us not forget the significant events why we have come this far. For our national hero, Dr. Jose Rizal, once said, "He who does not know how to look back at where he came from will never get to his destination." I hope this video refreshes your mind. Have a great day and keep learning.